All right, 7 minutes after the hour. In half an hour, we're going to have George Knapp from KLAS TV in Las Vegas on as a guest, and we're going to talk more about this stuff out there in the Great Basin. Now, Junior Hicks, I mentioned there towards the end of the last hour. He says that there have been thousands of other cases than the 400 or so he has categorized. But he says that at least half of the residents out there, which is about 50,000 people, have seen all these weird things, the flying saucers, the cigar-shaped craft, the zigzagging balls of light. So many different objects, Junior Hicks says, that the local police and the highway patrol long time ago stopped taking reports on this stuff. And many of the lawmen themselves, of course, have witnessed this stuff. And Hicks said the stuff really started getting... Now, interestingly enough, it's dying off. The incidence of all these things are really slowing down. It started real heavy in the 50s. He said there were cases where the whole school and all the teachers would see these things hovering over the town in broad daylight. In the 60s and the 70s, he said they had more sightings, UFO sightings, than any other place in the world. Now, but the run-of-the-mill UFO events don't begin to describe the unusual phenomena in this area. I mean, it's not just like another place where weird stuff happens. The Ute Indian tribe has been there far longer than any of the whites, of course. And the tribal leaders, very reluctant to speak to any of the outsiders, but their oral history is just replete with examples of these strange creatures and these sightings. And the Indians themselves, their lore is what refers to these things as skinwalkers. Other cultures will call them shapeshifters. Eastern Europe calls them werewolves. Bigfoot. Out there they call them, the Utes call them the skinwalkers. And the Utes, of course, take this very seriously. They think the skinwalkers are these powerful spirits that are here because of some curse that was put on the Utes generations ago by the Navajo, and that the center of the whole legend is this ranch that we'll be talking about. And the Utes say that this ranch is in the path, or this ranch is the path of the Skinwalker. And so tribe members are strictly forbidden from setting foot on any of this property, and it's been that way for years, long before 1994 when the Gormans first moved into this place. And it's about a 480-acre spread of rich, well-watered pasture, a few thick patches of tall cottonwoods. Anybody that's driven between Roosevelt and Vernal, you know the area I'm talking about. And this ranch is divided into 3 different sections, each section being a former homestead that all end up becoming one. There's real thick brush in some places. A river borders one side of it. But the Skinwalker Ridge that runs through it is what the Utes refer to that area as. And a long dirt road is the only way in or out of the ranch. So when Gorman, which again is not his real name, bought this place in 1994, it had been vacant for a number of years. And his wife and his kids, 2 kids in fact, were very curious about when they first moved into the house. The house was loaded with this impressive array of door bolts. All the outside doors had a mess of bolts on the doors. Now that would, if I walked into a house out in the middle of nowhere like that, that would be the first thing that ran the hair up on the back of my neck. But even the kitchen cabinets had bolts on them. And at both ends of the house, there were these iron stakes and heavy chains that had been installed. And they thought, well, the previous tenants probably had put large guard dogs in the front and the back of the home, but of course he had no idea at the time why someone would have put large guard dogs in the front and the back of the house. So here comes the Bulletproof Wolf. This was one of the most intriguing things, and this book is available at Amazon.com. There's a receipt in the book that Ryan left in here for Barnes & Noble. The book is called Hunt for the Skinwalker. So one of the more impressive parts of the book is one day the Gormans had moved their furnishings onto the property, and they spotted this extremely large wolf out in the pasture. This is right at the beginning of their experiences on the ranch. And this wolf cautiously makes its way across the field, and then to the surprise of everyone, sidles up to the family, acting like it was the family's favorite pet, and it's a huge wolf. And it had rained that day, and the family remembers that the wolf smelled like a wet dog as they were petting it. And after a few minutes, the wolf strolls over to the corral and grabs a calf that's in the corral by its snout, trying to pull the calf through the corral bars. So Gorman and his father, who happens to be there, begins beating the wolf on the back with these sticks, but it won't release the calf. So Gorman grabs his .357 Magnum from his truck and shoots the wolf at point-blank range, and the slug has no noticeable effect. So Gorman pumps another bullet into the wolf, which then let go of the calf, but stood looking at the family as if nothing had ever happened. So Gorman shoots it 2 more times with this .357 Magnum. And the big animal backs off just a little bit, but doesn't show any signs of distress. It doesn't even show any signs of blood. So people standing there in utter shock, So Gorman goes and gets his hunting rifle and shoots the wolf again, this time at an even closer range. Now, Gorman's not only an experienced marksman, but he is a big game hunter of considerable repute. So 5 slugs would have been enough to bring down an elk without even trying, let alone a wolf. So the 5th shot causes this chunk of hair and flesh to fly off of the wolf, but the wolf still doesn't seem to be fazed. So after a 6th shot, again from the high-powered rifle, the wolf just casually trots across the field into this muddy thicket. So Gorman and his father track down this beast for about a mile, following its footprints through the mud, but the tracks suddenly end as though it just vanished into air. Didn't disappear. It was in the mud. They followed the tracks in the mud till the tracks stopped, as though the animal disappeared into the air. So they come back to the corral area, and Gorman he picks up this chunk of the wolf flesh and says it looked and smelled like rotten, dead meat. So he makes these inquiries with his neighbors. No one seems to know anything about any tame, oversized wolves running around the area. So a few weeks later, Mrs. Gorman encounters a wolf that was so large that its back was parallel with the top of her window as it stood beside her car. And then the wolf was accompanied by some other dog-like looking animal that she could not identify, never having seen anything like it, and could not see anything like it in any animal books. So over the next 2 years, this menagerie of all these weird animals was reported by family members and neighbors and began to show up more and more. And so while driving into the ranch on this bright, sunny afternoon, Gorman and his family saw something attacking one of their horses. And they describe it as something that was very low to the ground, heavily muscled, weighing about 200 pounds, with curly red hair and a big bushy tail. They said it looked something like a very muscular hyena, and it seemed to be clawing at the horse, almost playing with it. So Gorman gets within 40 feet of this animal, but says it just literally vanished in front of his eyes. Poof, gone. So they checked the horse and found all these claw marks on its legs. And a few months later, the wife of a deputy sheriff reported seeing some similar muscular reddish beast running across their property. Another visitor to the ranch has a rather more ominous encounter in the middle of their homestead, the same place where these other things have been taking place, very close by. And the visitor, along with Gorman and his son, say that they saw this large, blurry something moving through the trees. Now, I remind you, I'm reading this late at night, before I go to sleep to get up the next morning to do a radio show. It's a little spooky the further you get into this book. So, I mean, and they said the visitor had been meditating when this thing shows up. They had a visitor to the ranch who was out there doing meditation stuff, seeing if he could link into what was going on. So he's out there meditating, and this thing shows up. And it swiftly is moving from the trees across the pasture, covering 100 yards in a few seconds. When it finally came up, reached the man, lets out this ferocious roar, something akin to a large bear, they said. A roar loud enough to be heard hundreds of yards away. But they said, of course, this was no bear. It was, according to the Gormans, nearly invisible, representing or resembling the camouflaged being in the movie The Predator. Those of you who've seen The Predator, you know what I'm talking about. The visitor who was out there meditating at the invitation of the Gormans to try to make contact with something was so frightened, he grabbed onto Gorman with his eyes closed in a fetal position and would not let go of Gorman for a moment's thought until he finally gets some composure, leaves the ranch, and never, ever, ever returned. And so these other creatures and these beings, others were also seen, some rather exotic multicolored birds that were certainly not native to northeastern Utah. And then a lot of numerous close encounters with 9-foot-tall beasts that resembled a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And as if those visual experiences weren't enough, the family claims that its other senses were also challenged by all kinds of assorted weird events. They often were overwhelmed by very strong, musky odors, and the pastures would unexplainably light up at night like a football stadium. And they claim to have seen these shafts of light from above, and some seemingly emanated from the ground up to the sky, conduits of light, they said. And they and others say they would hear what sounded like heavy machinery operating down underneath the earth, and they would hear voices. And then Tom Gorman and his son and his nephew remembered hearing this loud, disembodied conversation in some unintelligible language. And the disembodied male voices would speak in what the witnesses say was some mocking tone and sounded like they were emanating from 20 or more feet up in the air above their heads, but they would see nothing at all, just hear the voices. And the dogs accompanying the three witnesses growled and would bark at the voices, and then they would take off in a panic. These were physical manifestations that just, they are not easily explained in any stretch of the imagination. So while checking on his herd in the third homestead, Gorman noticed that someone had dug up his pasture, and hundreds of pounds of soil had been scooped up out of the ground, piled up on the edge. And he said the edges of the hole resembled perfect concentric circles, as if someone had dropped this giant cookie cutter into his pasture. All right, 24 minutes after 6. Before too much longer, we'll have Mr. Knapp on as a guest. So anyway, I'm trying to give you some background here so that when he gets on the air, we won't have to go through all of this, except for the personal stuff that he witnessed and the scientists that were out there who witnessed this stuff, and things that were in the sky, too, not just the stuff that was on the ground. While checking on their cattle in the spring of 1995, Gorman and his nephew had spotted what they thought was a recreational vehicle that was parked out on their property. Well, if you see somebody out on your property in a recreational vehicle, you want to know something about it and why. So they approach it figuring the driver might be having some kind of mechanical trouble, but as they get closer, the RV, moves, silently away from them. And then the closer they get, the further it moves away. So they finally climb this fence to get a better look at it, and that's when they finally figured out this thing was no Winnebago. The craft rises up above the treetops, slowly flows away, making no sound whatsoever as it departs. It wasn't a helicopter. The witnesses had a clear view, say the object was shaped much like a refrigerator with a single light on its front and a red light on the back. And so before long, everyone in the family starts seeing these weird aerial objects, and Mrs. Gorman says something that resembled a stealth fighter but ringed with these blinking disco lights silently hovers about 20 feet over her vehicle without making a single sound before it goes zipping off. And then each family member has these repeated sightings of a cloud that usually just hovers outside the property. And the cloud was characterized as having all these little blinking Christmas tree lights or some kind of silent mini-explosions going on inside of it. And among the other aerial craft that were seen by the Gormans, their neighbors and other witnesses were these classic flying saucer objects and flying sombreros, these shafts of light that are similar to fluorescent light bulbs, and on all these cigar-shaped craft that were several football fields long. So by far the most common objects that they witnessed were these floating spheres of different sizes and colors. In 95 and 96, the Gormans and others reported 12 separate incidents of seeing these large orange circles flying over the trees. Gorman claims that holes would occasionally open up in these orange spheres and these smaller spheres would come flying out of them. And a neighboring rancher told a reporter that one of his own encounters, with which he described simply as being a big, large orange basketball floating around in the sky. So, by early 1996, they'd been there for a year and a half, and the sighting of these spheres at the ranch, were commonplace. I mean, these orbs, they said, were about the size of a softball. They were made of glass. They were filled with this bubbling blue liquid that seemed to rotate inside the sphere. The Gormans said that by April of 96, I think, that they had watched one of these orbs repeatedly circling the head of one of their horses. And suddenly the horse was illuminated by this intense blue light, and there was a sound like static electricity in the air, but there, wasn't any ball lightning. The orb seemed to be intelligently controlled, making sense out of its movements. So when Gorman approached the horse with a flashlight, the orb just darted off and disappeared through the tree branches, he said, with incredible speed and dexterity. It seemed to know where to move. Then the Gorman said that these blue spheres seemed to generate psychological effects on family members, and these waves of fear would come over them when their blue orbs were around them. And they said it was one of these blue orbs that finally convinced the Gormans to sell the ranch. All right, we're back. Those of you who have lived in Las Vegas area, who've watched Channel 8, Eyewitness News, CBS, you'll remember George Knapp was a TV anchorman down there. We're still trying to get him on the air. We've made several calls. My producer, Daryl, talked to him yesterday. Yeah, I talked to him yesterday. He said he'd be available this morning. 7:30. Was that our time or 7:30 his time? We're still trying to call him and get him on the air with us. So, anyway, it was the appearance of one of these blue orbs in particular I was talking about that finally convinced the Gormans it was time to sell. Every time I would go through another chapter of this book, I keep thinking, what are these people waiting for? I mean, what happens in the very beginning of the book was enough for me to, Mary, I think it's time to go. I hear the call to the opposite side of this planet. So one evening in May 1996, Gorman's outside with 3 of his dogs when he notices this blue orb that's darting around in the field near the ranch house. Now, put yourself in his position and just think about, if you had been seeing this stuff going on for some time, how long would you put up with this? But see, they had moved here. Their whole life savings went into this. They wanted to farm it. It was several hundred acres. This was going to be where they were going to live the rest of their lives. Raise the kids to adulthood and then retire and live there the rest of their lives, because they had some very valuable stock on that property that they had brought with them. So here's this blue orb that keeps showing up. Well, here it's dancing around in the field. So finally, Gorman lets his dogs loose and urges them to go after the ball, and the dogs chase, and they jump up and snap at this orb, but it dodges and maneuvers enough to stay just beyond the reach of their snapping jaws. And the ball leads the dogs out across the pasture into this thick brush that borders the field. And Gorman says he heard the dogs make 3 terrible yelps, and then they were silent. And then he calls for them, but they don't respond. Well, the next morning he goes looking for the dogs, and what he finds are these 3 round spots of dried, brittle vegetation, and in the middle of each of these round spots of dried, brittle vegetation are these black, greasy lumps. So he figures his dogs had been incinerated by something, but one thing for sure, he never saw his dogs again. And it was the disappearance of these dogs that finally prompted the Gormans to think about getting out. Now, he's not some country bumpkin just trying to get by. This guy, Tom Gorman, had college degrees and advanced training in animal husbandry. He was considered an expert in artificial insemination. He had plans for raising hybrid high-end stock. His herd, which ranged from 60 to 80 head, consisted of very expensive top-of-the-line heifers. He had 4 2,000-pound show-class bulls. And from the day he had moved, I mean, this guy knows something about animal husbandry. So from the day he moves his herd onto the ranch, though his hopes and his animals seemed to be under some kind of an assault from the day they got there. And the balls of light that were so often on his property seemed to take this special interest in the cattle and were often seen buzzing around the heads of the animals. And sometimes the cattle would react violently, and the herd splitting suddenly as if some invisible force was plowing through the middle of the herd. But it got worse. Although the Gormans kept close watch on their stock, something began exacting a terrible toll on these animals. One cow was found dead in a field, and this strange, very crisp, tight surgical hole had been cut in one of its eyes. And there were no tracks, there were no blood. There was no blood. He wondered what could have done such a thing, and he notices a very strong, musky odor around the carcass. A smell, he said, that he and his family would come to know all too well. Then the other cattle began to be carved up, as if with pinking shears, he said. Cattle mutilations have been reported, as you well know, everybody, from, throughout North America for several decades. Colorado's had a mess of them, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana. In these typical cases, the eyes and the ears and the udders and the sex organs were often removed with surgical precision. And Gorman's animals, he said, were subject to all of the above. And this is high-end stock. These just aren't some ragtag animals sitting out there. This is money. These animals are money. It's like somebody carving up your $100 bills with surgical precision to where they're worthless. Well, he's an experienced hunter and rancher, so Gorman's a little more than familiar with the capabilities of natural predators, and he said this wasn't being done by coyotes or mountain lions, which is usually the way these things are written off. I mean, the butchery was simply just too clean, and no blood was ever left at the scene of the attacks. And his other animals were suffering. His favorite horse had its legs slashed, as if by some kind of sharp instruments or claws. And any time they would find animals like this, there was always this musky odor that was still in the air when he would discover the damaged animals. And then the dogs begin, whatever dogs are left at this point, begin to develop paranoia. They would stay inside their dog houses for days at a time, too fearful to come out of their dog houses even for food. 6 of the family's cats vanished in one night alone. And then all of a sudden the cattle started disappearing altogether. One of the animals vanished from a snow-covered field. Gorman said that he saw the footprints lead into the field, and then the track simply stopped as if the animal had been plucked up into the sky. A 1,200-pound cow leaves tracks in the snow the last time I saw, so what happened to this one? But in all, 14 of Gorman's prized animals were either sliced up or vanished. In one instance, a cow was found mutilated just 5 minutes after Gorman's son had checked on it. Something cut a hole about 6 inches wide and 18 inches deep in the animal's rectum. And the cord out section extended into the cow's body cavity, but there was no blood on the cow, and there was no blood on the snow-covered ground where just minutes earlier the animal had been seen in a perfectly normal state. So he lost about 14 of these expensive animals from an 80-head herd. That's extreme by any standards. Maybe during the winter in the Uinta Basin you might lose 1 to a bear or wolves or something, but 14 out of 80? Well, it meant that he was close to financial collapse. You can't lose that many animals from a herd that small and make any kind of progress. Well, it just gets worse. And even though I have read the book and have sworn I will never read something like this again on a dark night, and going through my experience with having read this book so far for about the last 40 minutes, we now have George Knapp here Let's see if I got this all hooked up. George, you there?
I am. Good morning, Jack.
Oh, hey, welcome to K-Talk. Glad to have you here. It's a book that I've had an awful lot of fun with. One of the people mentioned in the book, Ryan Layton, is an old friend of mine from a couple of decades ago, and he brought me his copy of the book, which I've gone through, Hunt for the Skinwalker. And you being one of the co-authors of the book, we wanted to get you on here and talk about this because, it's one thing to read some fiction, and there's a lot of good horror stories out there by a whole series of guys who regularly write this kind of stuff. It's another thing when you read this stuff that purports to be a series of true actual events and occurring just a couple, 100 miles or so down the road, as one of the most peculiar areas on the face of the planet. Now, what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen, Hunt for the Skinwalker, if you're just tuning in and you haven't heard what I've been talking about it, what I've been saying about it, where science finally confronts these unexplained... I was telling everybody a series of events that have occurred there, George, before the science team finally shows up to find out what the heck's going on. But the book title, ladies and gentlemen, Hunt for the Skinwalker, you can get it at Amazon.com, you can get it at Barnes & Noble, BN.com, you can get it at any of the local stores. My gosh.
Yeah, it's a handful to think that these are true events, but they are. I mean, true in the sense that the witnesses actually reported them. The scientific team went to great lengths to investigate them. They didn't come away with a lot of solid proof or anything that a reasonable audience would conclude would be proof, but there is plenty, and it mostly starts with the human testimony. The focus of this, of course, is the Uinta Basin. The epicenter of all the activity is this particular ranch, 480-acre ranch near Roosevelt, near Fort Duchesne. And things have been going on there for 50 years that we know of, probably a lot longer.
Well, the Ute Indians themselves in their oral histories record a long time ago.
Exactly. And the Utes, as you know, that's where the title comes from. They believe that this particular ranch is, in their words, in the path of the Skinwalker. They believe that they've got some kind of a curse on them, and that whatever this thing is, it's sort of their umbrella explanation for all the strange stuff that's happened on this particular property. But they don't go on the property. They advise their tribal members not to go on the property because the place is cursed by something bad. And I guess you've already listed
I've talked about the wolf. I've talked about the Skinwalker itself. I've talked about the lights. A lot of the aerial phenomena that occurred even in the daylight, witnessed by more people than just the Gormans. There are several things. I was just getting to the point where the National Institute for Discovery Science was about to show up. I haven't gone into that part yet, but still, one series of events after another like this, the question that kept coming up in my mind as I'm reading this book is, if I had been Mr. Gorman, the very earliest incidences here recounted in this book, I'd have had a for sale sign out in front of that farm a lot earlier than he did.
I've heard that comment a lot since the book has been out, and I relate to it. But this guy was stubborn. I mean, this was his dream property.
Oh yeah, and this guy is no hick.
Yeah.
I mean, he has degrees. He has prized herds. He's an expert in artificial insemination. He has these huge 4,000 or 2,000-pound bulls. That this was going to be a money-making opportunity to him with some prize stock until he runs up against the Skinwalker.
He just wasn't going to give up. I mean, for a long time, he thought somebody was messing with his head. Maybe the military was doing this, and he was going to get to the bottom of it one way or another. And I will bet you that wherever he is right now, and I have a pretty good idea where he is, that part of him still wishes that he could stick around and stalk this thing and figure out who did this to he and his family.
Well, I'm an upper cervical chiropractor in the Salt Lake area, and I draw in a patient load from hundreds of people from Idaho, Wyoming, far eastern Utah, and I have patients who, when I find out they're from Roosevelt or they find out they're from Duchesne or any of those areas out there, I always immediately, even during the consultation, I'll ask them about this stuff. Oh, yeah. I mean, they're as familiar with that as they are with the pioneer history of Utah. I mean, it's like, well, so big deal, you know. Let me get back to why I came to see you. No. Did you see anything? Oh, yeah, we saw that stuff all. Well, did it ever? Well, at first it bothered us, but, you know, after a while it begins to be commonplace and you don't think about it.
Well, we interviewed a heck of a lot of people up in that area throughout the Uinta Basin, and I don't think we found anyone who hadn't had an experience or whose family hadn't had an experience with UFOs or cattle mutilation or something along those lines.
Well, I asked this person if they knew the Gorman character, and they had in fact, this one woman, her name's Maureen. I'm not going to mention her last name, but she said, and of course that's not their name. She knows the real people, and she knows where they've gone, and she said, I could probably put you in touch. And I said, I don't think they want that. From what I read in the book, they would just as soon be left alone at this point.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah,
I mean, they want nothing to do with it. In fact, it's bothered a lot of people that we had to change the names, but the names are well known. I mean, they were out there in a couple of news articles in the past, and everybody wants to dig them up.
You can find out who it is.
Ryan Layton, your friend Ryan Layton, was on the ranch several times and knew the family and interviewed them about these kinds of things long before NIDS was on the scene, too.
Yes. So now, what is your relationship to NIDS? I mean, being an investigative news reporter for Eyewitness News in Las Vegas on KLAS TV. What's your relationship to NIDS, and how you got involved with this?
Well, I started doing stories about UFOs and Area 51 back in the late 80s, and it sort of caught the attention of Robert Bigelow, the guy who founded NIDS, and he and I just formed a friendship. And so over the years, as he has financed NIDS and a lot of other kinds of research into so-called paranormal topics, he'd let me know what was going on. It was the same way for the ranch. I mean, I was getting the reports about the ranch for 7 years as they poured in, and it was chomping at the bit to do a story, but one of the conditions was that I couldn't do anything until they gave me permission, because they just simply didn't want all kinds of people showing up at the property, having tailgate parties, and setting up shop to look for UFOs. So it drove me crazy for a long time to keep quiet about it, but that was the deal. But eventually I kept pestering NIDS and Mr. Bigelow, and they allowed me onto the property finally, and I started working on a documentary that eventually led to the book.
All right, we're going to go to a break here for a second. George Knapp out of Las Vegas, Eyewitness News Channel 8, and co-author of the book, Hunt for the Skinwalker. You know, we do a lot of books on this show, but this is one book you have got to read. Now, let's get into the scientific aspect of this. How scientific is NIDS?
Well, it's world-class. I mean, Bigelow put together a world-class science advisory board, some names that you would know, including 2 former U.S. astronauts, a lot of folks who had worked for government agencies and national labs. I mean, top-flight folks. That's the advisory board.
Right. This wasn't the people who showed up there weren't a bunch of witchers with little sticks trying to figure out what's going on.
No. Some
high-tech equipment showed up. We're
talking about PhD level scientists, biologists, physicists. We had a veterinarian on the staff. They had a variety of folks with a lot of experience dealing with very high-tech stuff. And again, yeah, they did. One of the first things they started to do when they arrived on the property is to lay it out sort of in grids and map it out. They inspected it to figure out if maybe the cause of these phenomena were plant-induced or animal-induced, or there was something in the air or in the water or in the ground, and they couldn't find anything of that sort, so they installed a lot of high-tech surveillance equipment, cameras and microphones and things of that sort, put the ranch under 24-hour-a-day surveillance over a period of several years to try to figure out what the heck this was. And it turned out that whatever it is elusive. It sort of made purposefully avoided the surveillance. For example, you put a camera in one pasture, then things would happen on the other side, and it played mind games with the ranch family and with the NIDS scientists.
So, other than just opening or the possibility of some vortex or something opening up into another dimension that they could see through the window into. There was actually some intelligent display in this elusiveness that indicated there was something more than just some window opening into another dimension.
No question. I mean, it toyed with them in a lot of ways, as with the family. You know, you've mentioned to your listeners a lot of the big, scary events that happen. The stuff that kind of freaks me out the most are the little events, the tiny little, like, poltergeist events that would play with their heads. For example, mom goes to town to go shopping for enough groceries for a couple of weeks. She comes home. She puts all the bags on the table, takes all the food out and puts it away in the cabinets. She walks down to the bathroom and is gone for 2 or 3 minutes, comes back, and all the food's back out of the pantry and back into the bag, stuff like that.
Yeah, see.
Dad's out in the pasture. He's using a big post hole digger. He stops for just a second to wipe his brow, get a sip of water, looks back, and the post hole digger's gone. He finds it a couple of weeks later, 40 feet up in a tree. Things like that would happen all the time. The incident with the bulls that you mentioned, the mom and dad as they're going past the bulls and these 2,000-pound bulls in the corral, and they mention to each other, boy, if something happens to them, we're really in trouble. And as soon as they come back, they notice all 4 of them are gone, and I think you've already told the story where they found them. That kind of stuff suggests that this was in the words of one NIDS scientist, a precognitive sentient entity. It seemed to know what they were going to do. It was smart, and it played with them.
I didn't really get a chance to tell the bull story.
Well, the story was.
Well, we've only got about a minute.
Mom and Dad were driving to town. They had already lost several of their animals and were on the verge of financial ruin. And they said to themselves, "Boy, if something happens with these bulls, we're in big trouble." 4 2,000-pound bulls were all in this tiny corral near the ranch house. When they drove back and they saw all 4 of the bulls are gone. Well, they're panicking. They're running around looking for the animals, and inside the corral there's this metal trailer. There's only one door to it. It's wired shut, thick metal wire. The father, almost ready to give up, looks in this tiny grate at the top of the trailer, and there's all 4 bulls in the trailer, crammed together, almost like they had been forced into there, and they're kind of in a trance.
Hold on. We're going to have to pick up that on the other side of the news. George?
Yeah, Jack, I'm wondering if anybody ever took an .6 or something and tried to take one of those things out. Thanks, bye.
All right, that just came in on the Jack This line. I referred to the big wolf that occurred or back at the very beginning during the first hour of the show where, they had used a high-powered rifle several times on this animal, even blew off a chunk of meat from the animal that had all the appearance of being rotten. Later on when they took a look at it, and the animal just kind of casually walks off till it finally disappears. They've tried that. George, you there?
Yes, I am.
Good. I'm wondering, we've only got 30 minutes, so I want to get to the point here in a hurry. But I'm kind of wondering, with all the apparitions that they saw in the house, all these lights, all these dark creatures that would peer in the windows, to the point where they would finally sleep as a family together on the floor in the living room. Did anyone ever say to these things, "Hey, go towards the light"?
I'm not sure that they used that exact phrase, but there were interactions in particular between the family and these entities. I mean, there was one instance where they're walking. The mom and dad are out in the pasture walking at night, and these voices are chatting at them, like apparently coming from 8 or 9 feet above their heads.
Yes,
yakking away in some strange language, and they yell at them to be quiet, and then these voices were quiet for a second, then they sort of were mocking and laughing at them. There were incidents where these blue orbs that caused so much terror among them were floating around, and they used a flashlight, to try to scare it away, and it did. It worked for a second. There were incidents where they chased the animals that they saw in the fields and tried to interact with them. One incident that happened while the NIDS scientists were there that was really chilling. They'd had a series of animal mutilations over a couple of days before, and they heard the dogs barking out in the field. Well, the rancher grabs his gun and jumps in his truck and goes barreling out into the pasture, and the NIDS people jumped in another truck and were following. The rancher jumps out of his truck because there's a tree line right on the edge of the property. He sees something very large inside one of the trees. It was like giant, like foot-long eyes, yellow eyes, up in the tree, and then a large bear-looking creature in the bottom of the tree. So he grabbed his rifle and shot the one on the ground, and hit it, and it disappeared. I mean, poof, in the middle of the air. He shot the one out of the tree, and it fell to the ground. He and the NIDS scientists go chasing after this thing, and they found one big footprint in the snow. There's a snowbank at the bottom of this tree, great big footprint with it was like a raptor print, like a dinosaur. They go chasing off into the bush looking for this wounded animal, and never found anything. Never found another print. They had professional trackers that came in looking for this thing. In particular, they had them after the calves were mutilated. Never found anything. So there were a variety of different ways that were found to try to interact with whatever it was. None of them worked.
Now, we've only got you for a whole lot longer. What I want to do is, what is NIDS' conclusion on this? What is your conclusion on all of this? And now that things are kind of winding down and there's not a whole lot of activity,
right?
What do you think's going on here?
Well, NIDS doesn't have a conclusion. I mean, they're a group of scientists that what they went into it, as I mentioned before, they kind of went in trying to eliminate possibilities, eliminate the obvious of, say, hallucinogenic plants or geomagnetic anomalies, things of that. I think the scientists have individual conclusions, and it leads sort of in the direction where the book went, and that is that this place is some sort of a portal, that it's some kind of a, the Irish have a saying of places where the world is thin, and that seems to be what this is. It's, things come and go, animals from other places come and go, craft from other places come and go. It seems to be indicating that a lot of the stuff that we would classify as paranormal are all interrelated, and maybe we consider them to be paranormal now, but only because we don't understand the true structure of the universe. I think, Colin Kelleher and I, the co-authors, kind of came to conclude that the only explanation that seems to fit all the stuff that happened was this dimensional thing, that maybe there are other intelligences that we cannot detect, but that they can detect us, who are much more in control of the situation, and whose existence represents a much greater reality than what we have in mind. That we know the known universe. Cosmologists and physicists are telling us that there are many universes, many worlds out there, other dimensions, and quite possibly other intelligences, and that seems to be the only one that fits.
Well, and this is kind of where you go towards the end of the book, that you give an analogy of an ant mound next to a 10-lane highway. Does the ant have any idea of what's going on nearby? Maybe when you consider the fact that dogs were incinerated, expensive animals were mutilated, yet there wasn't any real physical harm committed to the Gorman family, would indicate that there was some intelligence that recognized human life as apart from the animal life.
You're exactly right, Jack. And it seemed it clearly made a distinction. Whereas they were willing to cut up and incinerate other kinds of animals, they didn't really harm, other than psychologically, didn't physically harm the people. Whatever this intelligence was, it was able to make that distinction. It seemed to us that it was kind of a learning curve, that it was teaching us, leading us down, the family, leading them down a path to try to have a better understanding of a much greater world, a much larger universe than what we've imagined.
Yeah, that there actually may be entities that are millions of years more advanced than we are, and that somehow we may be, it's very humbling to think of that we may be some protected species. And there just happens to be a few places in the three-dimensional physical universe that we know of, the wormholes or portals or whatever they are that exist at this place out there, that actually is a doorway into other dimensions. Now, I got an off-air call saying, the bull story, get back to the bulls. He didn't finish the bulls.
Oh.
So here we find, because that was a great story. Here we find 4 2,000-pound animals crammed like oversized sardines into this trailer, And then when Gorman yells to his wife that he's found them, the bulls seem to come out of this dream state.
Yeah, it was like they were in a trance or had been drugged or something inside this trailer. And when he yells to his wife, "Hey, honey, they're in here," they wake up and they start kicking the heck out of this trailer inside. Now, you can't possibly get one of those 2,000-pound bulls, big, surly animals, into that trailer. How somebody got all four of them into there, crammed together, and the door was never opened. I mean, it was still wired shut.
And there were cobwebs inside the door.
Exactly. How this was done, I mean, I can't even imagine it. It's the same like with the calf mutilation. There was one incident of a calf mutilation. How it was physically done, I don't know. The rancher and his wife it's a Sunday morning, it's 10 o'clock. There have been several newborn calves on their property, so they're going to go out and tag the ears of these animals. They go out, they find the first mother cow and her calf about 50 yards from their ranch house, and they tag this ear, and they go off across the pasture. Now, I think you've probably seen pictures, Jack. It's not a really hilly area. I mean, you can see across the pasture. The mom and dad were gone like 40 minutes from tagging the first animal, and they hear their dog making a noise looking back in the direction of the first one. They turn around, and the mother cow its eyes are bulging out in terror. It's running around in circles, dragging its leg as if it had been injured. So they go running back over to the scene, and they find this calf that they just tagged completely decimated. There's nothing but bone and hide left. Every scrap of meat, every organ in the body have been stripped off this animal. One of the femurs had been ripped out of the joint and just laid a few feet away from the animal. And what could do it? Now, NIDS was there within a couple of hours. They sent samples, tissue samples, bone samples, to a couple of independent labs at different parts of the country. They concluded that they looked at it under a microscope and concluded that two very sharp instruments had been used to wipe out 75 pounds of meat off the body of this calf in the course of a couple of minutes. One was a big machete-like object. The other was smaller and like a scalpel. But, there was no blood left in the animal. There's no blood on the ground. There are no tracks. They brought in a professional tracker to look around for whatever could have done it. Clearly, there's no predator in that we know of in existence that can eat 75 pounds of meat in a couple of minutes like that. You can think of maybe it's a Delta Commando force or something that was hiding in the bushes trying to do this, but what kind of a job is that for military folks? The conclusion was this calf had been taken somewhere else, that the surgery had been done somewhere else, and then that this thing had been just dropped back out into the pasture. But who did it and why?
Well, that's true. And then you start getting into the time continuum problem here. You're familiar with Jacques Vallée.
Sure.
And the work that he's done, of course. And one of the accounts that he gives in his several books is of this Brazilian lineman. There's a group of linemen that are working in the jungles of Brazil to bring in power. And while they're working, they notice one of their buddies is gone. And they start looking around for him, and they figure, well, he just went off to the jungle to relieve himself or something. And after a few minutes, he returns with 2 weeks of beard growth on his face and tells a story they cannot believe, but he had only been gone away from them for about 20, 25 minutes. Shows back up with 2 weeks of beard. The cobwebs inside the trailer of the door that would indicate the door had been shut for a long time, but the bulls had only been in there a matter of minutes.
Right.
There's something more going on here than just some governmental conspiracy thing of trying to cover up the government's advances with UFO or anti-gravity traffic and trying to create a Skinwalker legend around everything to try to scare everybody away from what the government is secretly doing in the Uinta Mountains.
Well, that certainly doesn't fit in this case.
No, but that's what a lot of people
dismiss. You could say that the government might have a psychological exercise underway, but they haven't been doing it for 50 years, which is how long this stuff has been going on.
And even longer with the Utes.
Yeah, that's not a government exercise, and I would wonder what Delta Commando gets the job of sneaking into the kitchen to take all the groceries out of the pantry. Or another example, the mom would take a shower every morning, and she'd lock the bathroom door. She puts a towel and a brush on the cabinet there. She'd come out and they're gone. She'd find the hairbrush in the microwave. She'd find the towel in the freezer hours later. I mean, what commando gets those kinds of assignments? It's not a military exercise, although I'm convinced that the military is certainly interested in what's going on there now.
Well, yeah, no doubt about that. Hold on. We'll be right back with George. A few more minutes. Don't go away.
Jack Stockwell on K-Talk.
Hey. All right, 24 minutes after the hour. Mr. Knapp can only be here for a few more moments. So, George, I want to do two things. Number one, where is all of this now in your mind and in NIDS' experience? And then number two, I want to bring on at least one caller. Had something very interesting to say.
Well, in my mind, I mean, I'm hoping that the activity one of these days resumes at the ranch. You know, it sort of got to a point where it didn't want to be stalked anymore. I mean, it obviously enjoyed the procedure and the interchange a lot more when it was in charge of things and terrorizing this family. When NIDS arrived on the scene, it didn't like it so much, so it's sort of gone underground. But I hope, and NIDS has hopes, that one day it will return and maybe can be studied or interacted with in a different way.
Did anybody try to study it or interact with it from a psychic point of view, or other than with dials and instruments? Yeah,
there were some attempts to that. They had what's called remote viewers that checked out the property. But I think the next approach would be if there's a resumption of activity, that NIDS would like to try something where it a less technological approach, maybe have some shaman and some psychics and things like that, try to interact with this thing as opposed to catching photographs of it.
Right.
That's the hope.
I want to get Cindy on here for a second. Cindy, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, Cindy was telling me an incredible experience she had in this same area. I want to know, George, if this sounds typical of what most people have experienced. Cindy, go ahead.
Okay. I can't remember exactly what the date was, but in the early 1990s, my family has property up in the Upper Uintas, and my sister and I went down. And one night, they had just a little telephone that we could use down by the river, and it was about maybe 11 o'clock at night, just barely a moon, so you could barely see just the outlines of the trees and whatnot. And as we approached the telephone, we could hear the river, and we looked down, and it looked like there were two helicopters coming up the canyon, which was about a mile wide on both sides. These helicopters were silent. They had the strobe lights going on at the very end on the very each side of the canyon, coming up just equally, equal sides, about 300, 400 yards above the ground. And as it got closer, we couldn't hear anything. We should have been able to hear the helicopter's blades. Couldn't hear anything. We looked again, and it absolutely floored us. It was a huge ship of some sort that reached from one side of the canyon to the other. It was that wide, and it was like a big, huge, I can't even see what it was. It was just an outline like a big, gigantic, oversized airplane, but it was dead silent. And we got terrified. We ran and got into our van and looked up into the sky and watched it. It got closer and closer to us. It lifted up, and we saw the silhouette of this massive, massive machine. It was huge. I've never seen anything like it in my life. And
I can say that I haven't heard exactly that story, but certainly similar stories. In fact, I would love to, Jack. I'd love to talk to your caller there, Cindy.
Yes.
Maybe interview and get some details on this at some point, because it's pretty similar. I mean, there were a lot of different aircraft seen in the area that looked like something conventional that turned out not to be, like the flying Winnebago that they saw on the ranch.
Well, it went up over the mountain tops. The next night, I was listening to Art Bell, and Linda Moulton Howe was on there giving her cattle mutilation updates. And it just so happened that up in that Duchesne County, right where that machine was heading for, or whatever it was heading for, there was a number of mutilated cattle that next day.
Cindy, what year is this?
I can't remember the exact year. It was early 1990s. I just remember I had a bunch of little kids, and they were just all very, very young. So it was 1990s, sometime early. about maybe 91, 92-ish. So, anyway.
Well, I'd love to hear more about it, Cindy, if I get a chance to talk to you off air.
I've never told anybody this before, but when I was listening to you today, it freaked me out, and I thought, oh.
Well, rest assured that you're not crazy, and a lot of other people have seen similar things.
Okay.
Now, what I'm going to do, Cindy, since I know your number, if you don't mind, when we finally go to a break here very shortly, I'm going to give George off-air your phone number. Is that all right?
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
All right, we're going to go to a break, and then we'll come back and say goodbye to George. 30 minutes after the hour, we have time for one more call. So let's get Andy on here. Andy, you're on with George Knapp.
Hi, Jack. Hi, George. Good job the other night.
Good morning.
I would never have called this in, Jack, but this is the only appropriate show for it. I belong to a study group, and there's a fellow that works for the government that comes to our Sunday group, and I will never tell you his name. He said
That's fine.
He said this to us in complete, utter confidence one night. He said that, and he's working right now. He goes all over the world for the military and does stuff in Alaska and Middle East and other places. He said there is a Stargate, is the word he used, either a natural Stargate or some ancient device, and it's buried in the Uintas, and the military's been all over it for a long time. My question is, have you ever heard that word before? You're saying the word portal, but a place where other dimensions come together, and these ships might be coming and going out of there, and they might be, they might be fishing, and they like cow eyes or something.
Yeah, well, the yummy cow parts. We eat cows, so that's not that unusual. I've heard the term Stargate before. I've never heard it applied to the Uinta Basin. There have been a variety. There are a couple of different top-secret government programs under the Stargate banner. One of them was remote viewing, but I've never heard it used there. I'd be really interested in learning more about it.
I know. Well, tell you what, they know how to get a hold of me. If you want my number, go ahead and let the producer give you. I'll give you his name, but he has to be willing. I'll just
I understand that.
His name and number.
I don't bother people that don't want to talk to me, but
he might as an anonymous.
I'd be very surprised if the military was not interested in what's been going on there.
Well, certainly if there is spacecraft or at least anti-gravity craft as big as what Cindy was describing from one mountain ridge to the next, filling the whole valley, not making 1 decibel of sound overhead and disappearing over a far mountain ridge, either the military is doing that or the military wants to know how to do that.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
one or the other.
Austin, my son and I were camping near there a couple of years ago in the middle of the night. We heard automatic weapons fire all over the place.
Huh.
Well,
I appreciate the call, and I hope I can get the number of that guy.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Andy.
Daryl will give it to you.
Appreciate your call.
You're welcome. Bye.
Hey, one other question here, George. How's Channel 8 Eyewitness News? How do they look at you in the midst of all of this, and with your other news investigative colleagues? First, it was Area 51, and then it was the Uinta Basin, and are you being pigeonholed off to the side somewhere?
Well, I have to be worried about that, but so far that's not happened. I mean, I've been here a long time, so people know that I have interest in things other than shoot 'em up and crooked politicians. And I'll tell you, where some of my journalism colleagues, mostly people who don't work for KLAS, like to give me grief about it, the public, the viewing public, can't get enough of it.
Oh no, that's true.
And so,
same thing here.
I'm serving the public, not my other colleagues. So I can't get enough, and they can't get enough, and I like doing it. And KLAS is tolerant of me; they just don't want me to go too far off the edge.
Okay. I know you have to go, so we'll kind of call it here at this point. But I'm going to put you on hold for a second because my producer needs to pick up just a couple of numbers so that we can make sure that because when we get the books and we want to, and we have some of your books coming in, you're going to arrive late. I want to be able to give them away on the air, and
sure.
And once we get this out a little bit more, I definitely want to be able to get you back on here.
I'll be glad to,
because there's
Jack.
a lot more questions. George, thanks so much. Hold on for a moment.
All right.
Here you have a battery of PhD level. I mean, it's a rather impressive team of physicists, engineers, psychologists, trying, and why do you bring the psychologists in? You bring the psychologists in to interview the families, interview the people involved, to make sure that you're not dealing with a bunch of nutcases. And other doctorate-level professionals for the purpose of simply investigating the subjects that are largely shunned by mainstream science. It's kind of it's a situation where when people don't want to believe something, they're not going to believe it, no matter what kind of evidence is brought before them. And of course, that has a lot of political ramifications as well. But and we didn't have time to get into all of the experience with the Gormans, but by the middle of '96, now I started the political show in March of '96. I was on the air from March '95 through March of '96 doing a health show. And it was in March of '96. What's that? That's 10 years ago that I started doing this Monday through Friday show. And it was shortly after that Ryan Layton contacted me and said, "Hey, Jack, there's something going on out there in the Uinta Basin, and you need to come out and take a look at it." And he explained this stuff to me, and I knew Ryan was a little, off-center. But then I am too. And we had been friends for a good 20 years so far. And he said, I'm going to set something up, and we're going to go out there, and we're going to spend a few nights out there on this farm. He didn't give me the names or anything at the time. He just said there's this farm out there. And because of the work that Ryan has done, and he calls in here on a regular basis, he was mentioned in the book, Hunt for the Skinwalker, as one of the people who'd been doing an awful lot of investigative work out there. But by the middle of 1990, I bring up 96 is because by the middle of 96, the Gormans were ready to just cash in their chips. I mean, those who know him say that he had blamed himself for the weird string of events that you've been hearing about for the last little while. Well, what they did next, I'll tell you about as soon as we get back. Now, tomorrow, Sanders Hicks is going to be my guest, who's the author of the book, The Big Wedding. And the Big Wedding, what The Big Wedding does is it examines the CIA's controlling client relationship with Pakistani intelligence and the ones who had close, documented, underreported links to the 9/11 terrorists. In The Big Wedding, in this book, The Big Wedding, and I think we got one or two to give away on the show, Sanders Hicks hits the road, starts going around to all the whistleblowers in the country, and he finds one, Randy Glass, who documents how the FBI was warned by Pakistani intelligence 3 years before the attack on 9/11. And so what he goes into is his original research with the neocons, the Bush family, the CIA, the Muslim Brotherhood, and his conclusion, of course, is that it's impossible that the White House did not have detailed foreknowledge of 9/11. So he, and all these whistleblowers, all these top researchers that he's bringing together into one book include Colleen Rowley, an ATF agent, Steve Barbaroni, Muhammad Atta expert Daniel Hopsicker, CIA asset Brad Ayers, and the Naval Intelligence veteran Delmart Vreeland. So that's going to, what time? 8, 7, 8 o'clock, 8 to 9. From 8 to 9 tomorrow morning. Sanders Hicks, author of The Big Wedding. It's another research book on the cover-up of 9/11, but it gets into an awful lot of the background information that comes from whistleblowers who were privy to what was going on. Now, I was talking about Gorman and the fact that they finally, when Bigelow and his team came to Utah, introduced themselves to the Gormans. These NIDS researchers check out the story. They interview the neighbors. They evaluate the Gormans, obviously incredible tales that you've been listening to for the last hour. Then Bigelow offers to buy the ranch outright, with the idea of trying to transform it into this big interactive paranormal laboratory, some ongoing experiment that might shed some light into the questions that obviously are viewed with a certain level of honest scientific skepticism. And but amazingly, he talks the Gormans into staying at the ranch as the caretakers. He buys it, but he wants them to stay there and take care of it. But of course, by this point, the family's a wreck. The UFOs, the balls of light, the mutilations, the disappearances, the Bigfoot sightings, and then the Skinwalker showing up himself, or herself, or itself. But, there's all these other things, the apparitions that they would see in the house, the blinding lights that would appear, all this psychic events that he was describing here, that George was describing of the packaging, the missing equipment, the groceries. You turn your back and the groceries are out of the shelf, back into the bags again. The furnishings, no one could sleep anymore. And when they did manage to, get a few hours of sleep, they're plagued by all these horribly violent nightmares. And often discovering that different family members that next morning had experienced the exact same dream the night before. So the two kids, which were, honor students before they arrived at the ranch, their grades began to plummet. Mrs. Gorman, of course, loses her job at the local bank because of all her repeated absences and all the little water cooler tales and stories that were going on. And so the folks from NIDS, all these PhD level people, they're offering the moral and emotional and financial support to the Gorman family. But what's more, they had this plan that they presented to them. And the ranch presented what appears to be, of course, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to legitimately study with scientific equipment this whole menu of paranormal activities that's going on. So they seal off the ranch and they pack it with all this high-tech monitoring equipment and they staff it with round-the-clock trained observers to see what would happen. And some of the residents, of course, sarcastically wondering what these hucksters from Las Vegas could possibly have in mind. They figure that there's some kind of a scam going on, the UFO buffs, and they still talk about it to this day, that Bob Bigelow's this shadowy guy with CIA connections, and he was somehow trying to corner the market on ET. And but as it turned out, all these groups are wrong. NIDS did seal off the ranch from all these outside observers, but not for monetary gain, and neither did the CIA nor any other government agency have any input or access to the things that were occurring while NIDS was on watch. And the phenomena itself didn't wither or evaporate. But for the last 6 years, the events have been under this constant scrutiny, and witnesses, including some very highly accomplished scientists and law enforcement personnel, have documented this mind-boggling array of unusual activity. But there's been a near total blackout lately on the release of any information coming from the site. And the most up-to-date information is in the book, The Hunt for the Skinwalker. You can go huntfortheskinwalker.com, get some information there. You can go to Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, to pick this up. It's what, $20 or something like that. But I'm telling you, one of the most fascinating reads, and scary because it purports to be true. Now, no one who's studied any of this can say with any certainty what's going on. That's what I was trying to get George to do. The NIDS researchers aren't making any claims about ETs or ghosts or skinwalkers. They're just collecting the data, trying to make some sense out of it, which is, small comfort to anybody else who's actually been in the midst of all of this kind of stuff. But you look at this long litany of bizarre activity that's occurred while the NIDS team was stationed at the ranch, including this shooting and tracking of this creature with 1 foot wide yellow eyeballs, falling out of the tree when it's shot and then disappearing right in front of their eyes. And then these ice circles, we didn't even get a chance to talk about that, which seemed to be the opening of some portal into another dimension. But what the word on the street now is, do not go to the ranch. You're not welcome. It's private property. The people who live on it or near it don't want to be hassled by the curiosity seekers, the media, the K-Talk listeners. And what's more, the level of unexplained phenomena suddenly has taken a nosedive in just the last few months of 2005. there's almost no activity going on at all. So chances are you wouldn't see anything even if you could get on the property. But that's what George wanted me to say in my concluding remarks on the whole thing before, because he just didn't have time to get into it anymore, which is, what I think I've done here the last 5 minutes. Daryl and Sandy are on the Stockwell Show.
Hi, Jack.
Yeah.
I've known Ryan almost as long as you have, maybe not quite as long, but I've been hearing these stories from him for years about the ranch out there, and everything you're saying is true.
Yeah.
I know it doesn't sound logical, but people are still camping out on the edge of the ranch, not quite on the property, and they're still, well, at least a few months ago, very, very weird stuff going on out there. And I mean, strange creatures that don't appear to be from this planet.
Yes.
Even. And it messes with their minds, and they'll wake up knowing they've been screaming while they were asleep. They have strange nightmares.
Hold on a second, Daryl. Hold on. We'll be right back. Got to take a quick break. Don't go away.
Jack Stockwell on K-Talk.
And we're back. We've only got a couple more minutes. Daryl, I'm going to give you another minute to wrap that up, and then we'll get on to Greg.
Okay. You really ought to join our UFO group, because we have people in our group that's been out there, camped out overnight, and experienced the strange alien creatures and so on. But we have a UFO meeting once a month on a Saturday afternoon. And in fact, a Navajo friend was there talking about the Skinwalker last month, and this semi-invisible Skinwalker, you call it, doesn't sound like a Skinwalker at all. It sounds like something totally different. The Skinwalker generally is like an Indian person through black magic and who knows what power turns him into a wolf.
The Navajos gave it.
Pardon me?
I say that's just the name the the Utes gave it.
Yeah, but this doesn't sound like, well, what every Indian tribe talks about the Skinwalker, it's like a visible, more like a wolf on two legs.
Uh-huh.
But this invisible thing doesn't sound like a Skinwalker at all. It just sounds like something else. But anyway, you ought to, you're free on a Saturday afternoon sometimes, aren't you?
Yeah, occasionally I am. That's true.
Well, once a month.
Whoops, sorry.
Once a month you should check us out. This month we're talking about the ghost chasers with all the instruments they use to find the entities and so on. You'd find it very interesting.
Thanks, Daryl.
Okay.
Appreciate it. All right, let me get Robert on here. Robert, you're on the Stockwell Show.
Good morning.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny to hear you having this discussion.
Why's that?
Just because you talk about everything else. Political, health-wise.
Hey, I've often made the statement, and it may get me in trouble one of these days, but I believe in everything.
It get you in trouble?
I believe in everything. I believe in the gods of Olympus.
You don't want to get in trouble. Pretty soon someone's going to shut you down.
I believe in aliens. I even believe in Greg Zenger.
It doesn't take too long, I think, for people to realize there's other things out there that we don't understand.
Sure.
And I understand that there are other societies that have put their posterity here upon the earth. You can take a look at the Pleiades star system.
Yeah.
The Osiris star system, the Orion star system. How many other star systems have put their posterity here upon the earth? And you take a look at Adam and Eve, right? And you think that the history of the earth is all described in the Old Testament, New Testament. I think there's a whole lot more history going on than what's been. It's like the Old Testament, New Testament, like a bat that's hitting us in the head, and we're told it's the only truth that's out there. I think that the U.S. government has agreements with some of these other societies who have higher technology, and we have no clue how much technology there is out there, how many face-to-face agreements and collaboration is going on with the U.S. government and some of these other beings.
You still there? Robert? Mwah. He disappeared. Mwah. Well, that's it. That's true. You, if there is a literal if there is a literal expression in the story of Adam and Eve, they came from another planet. Adam, I'm sure, had a belly button. Brought here from, the question is, who brought him here? But you know, and then you look at all the various cultures and societies on this planet and the absolute dearth of information that we have regarding the early history of man. And I think that's probably a good reason. I think there's a good reason why we don't have that information. But I'll tell you this, if God and our idea of God are one and the same, then we've lost our way on the search for truth. We've lost our path. Let me say that again, as simply as I can. If what God really is, in the sense of the ultimate everything, and our idea of him in that regard, is one and the same, then we somewhere have seriously jumped track in our search for truth. Because when you get into deep philosophical discussions regarding God, when you can raise the dead at the wave of a hand, then I want to talk to you. Till then, you know, it's just another idea. Or is that too nasty to say things like that? Tomorrow, the big wedding. We will be talking about the big wedding. In other words, the latest research on 9/11 from the whistleblowers themselves.
Jack Stockwell on K-Talk.